She said, "You don't have to do this." He said nothing. She told him she knew the debt wasn't real, that promises extracted from a dying man in the mud and blood of a rainy night weren't binding, that she was releasing him from the vow, from the obligation, from the burden of a woman who couldn't even see the pity on his face. Still, he said nothing. He just looked at her, the way a man looks at something he wasn't supposed to want. Then he took one step forward. And what he said next, those quiet, deliberate words in a penthouse above a city that had never once been kind to her, changed both of their lives forever. This is the story of a woman the world had already stopped seeing, and the dangerous man who refused to look away. Before we get into it, hit the like button and subscribe if you have not done that. The candles in the study had burned low, and Cecilia could feel the warmth of them from where she stood. A faint heat on the left side of her face, like the room itself was leaning in. She had counted 18 steps from the elevator, 12 from the door. She knew exactly where she was. She knew exactly what she was about to do. What she did not know was whether her legs would hold long enough to do it. She pressed her palms flat against the silk of her dress. "You don't have to marry me." The words came out steadier than she had expected. She had rehearsed them in the dark of her room the night before, her lips barely moving, the way she rehearsed everything now. Silently, carefully, in a world assembled from sound and texture and the weight of air. She had practiced them the way a woman practices the thing she is most terrified to say because she knows the answer might take the last solid thing from under her feet. Christian didn't move. She could hear him breathing, slow and controlled, the way he breathed when he was deciding something. She had learned that in 2 weeks. She had learned more about him through sound than most people learned through years of looking. "I know what Elias asked of you," she continued. Her voice stayed even. She was proud of that. "I know what he made you promise. But he's gone now. And a vow made to a dead man is a chain, not a contract. I'm releasing you from it." She paused. "You don't owe me anything." She waited for the exhale, the polite, measured agreement. Every person in her life had eventually found a reason to step back from her. Gently, carefully, the way people step back from something fragile they are afraid to break. Christian Voss had more reasons than any of them. He was 41 years old and built like consequence itself. He ran an empire held together by fear and cold precision. He did not need a 24-year-old woman who navigated his penthouse by counting tiles and couldn't see the expression on his face when he thought she wasn't paying attention. But Christian did not exhale. The silence did not loosen. Instead, she heard the quiet sound of him setting something down. A glass, crystal against marble, and then footsteps. Not fast, not slow. The deliberate walk of a man who has already made a decision and is simply crossing the room to deliver it. He stopped close enough that she could smell him. Cedar and smoke and cold, expensive air. "Are you finished?" he asked. Cecilia blinked. "What? Are you finished deciding what I want?" The question landed somewhere below her ribs. She felt the floor shift slightly. Not literally. She knew the floor was steady. Her feet told her that, but something tilted anyway. Christian's voice dropped lower. "I made a promise to your brother," he said. A pause, the kind he used like punctuation. "But I don't keep promises because they're easy, Cecilia." Another pause, longer this time. "I keep them because some debts have nothing to do with the dead." She stared in the direction of his voice. She could not see his face. She never could. But she heard the thing beneath the words, the rough, unguarded edge of a man who had spent years building walls and had just, without quite meaning to, let her hear the door. It had been raining the way it only rains in the worst moments of a man's life. Not hard, not dramatic, just relentless. A cold, patient rain that had no interest in theater, only in soaking through everything. Christian had pulled Elias off the asphalt himself. He remembered the weight of him. Surprising, how heavy a man became when he stopped fighting. And the sound Elias made, something low and wet that Christian had spent 3 months trying to unhear. He'd pressed both hands against the wound in his side. He knew, even then, that it was a gesture more than an action. The body knows before the mind admits it. "Hey!" Christian had kept his voice flat, controlled, the way he kept everything. "Stay with me." Elias had laughed. A short, broken sound. "You always say that like it's an order." "It is." The rain tapped steadily against the back of Christian's neck. Somewhere behind them, tires were screaming. His men, arriving too late, the way men always arrive too late to the things that actually mattered. Elias's fingers had found his wrist in the dark. Grip still tight despite everything. Still Elias. "Cece." Just the one word. But the way he said it, quiet and certain, like a man placing the only valuable thing he owned into someone else's hands, carried the full weight of it. "She has no one. When I'm gone, she has no one. You're not." "Christian." The grip tightened. His eyes were steady. That was the thing about Elias. Even at the end, his eyes were steady. "Don't." A long moment. The rain. The dark. The blood cooling between Christian's fingers. "She's blind and she's soft, and the family will eat her alive the second they find out about the inheritance." Elias's voice was dropping, the edges fraying now. "Promise me, not as my boss, as the only man I ever trusted." Christian had never made a promise he intended to break. He had also never made one that cost him nothing. He understood, kneeling in the mud with Elias's blood soaking into the knees of a suit that had cost more than most men made in a month, that this one would cost him everything. "I promise," he said. Elias exhaled, and did not breathe in again. The house was large in the way that powerful men's houses were always large, not for comfort but for distance. Room after room of carefully maintained silence, each one expensive enough that no one had ever been asked to actually live in them. Cecilia arrived on a Tuesday with one suitcase and the particular stillness of a person who had long ago learned to take up as little space as possible. Christian's housekeeper, a compact woman named Dora who communicated primarily through the decisive way she set things down, showed her to the East Wing. Christian watched from the top of the staircase. He told himself it was practical, making sure the transition was handled cleanly. He had always been good at telling himself things. He watched Cecilia pause at the threshold of the hallway. She turned her head slowly, not searching, not lost, but listening, taking inventory. Then she stepped forward, and he noticed what he hadn't expected to notice. She was counting. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly, and her right hand trailed the wall at the lightest possible pressure. Not gripping, just reading. 1, 2, 3. She stopped at the 4th door, reached for the handle, got it on the first try. Christian looked away. By the 3rd day, she had mapped the ground floor. He knew this because he had started watching for the moment she stopped reaching for the walls, a kind of graduation, quiet and uncelebrated. She moved through his kitchen at 6 in the morning with the coffee grinder and the particular efficiency of someone who had made peace with a world that didn't accommodate her. She knew the kettle was 3 steps left of the sink. She knew the mugs were on the 2nd shelf. He had not told her any of this. She had simply learned it in the dark, alone. On the 4th night, he found her standing in the doorway of the library, her head tilted slightly upward, as though she could sense the height of the ceiling, the space of it. There was something in her expression, not sadness exactly, something more like concentrated attention. The face of a person for whom the whole world was a text she had to read very, very carefully. He stood in the corridor for a long time before he turned and walked away. He had no name yet for what he felt. But guilt, he was beginning to understand, was only the first layer. They married at midnight on a Thursday, in a chapel that smelled of old stone and extinguished candles, with a priest who had long ago learned not to ask questions about the men Christian brought to him. There were no guests. There was no music. There was only the sound of rain against stained glass. It was always raining, Cecilia was beginning to think, in every important moment of her life, and the low, steady voice of a man reading words he had clearly not written for an occasion like this. Cecilia wore white because Dora had laid it out for her, and she hadn't had the energy to object. She didn't know what the dress looked like. She knew it had long sleeves and a neckline that caught the cold air of the chapel, and a train that whispered against the stone floor when she walked, for steps up the aisle, which was barely an aisle at all. She had counted before they began. She always counted. Christian stood very still beside her. She could feel the warmth of him on her left side, a solid, contained heat, like standing near something that had not yet decided whether to burn. When the priest reached the vows, Christian did not read from anything. He simply spoke quietly and without ceremony, the way he did everything that mattered to him. Mine to protect, he said. A pause. Mine to keep. Not a question. Not a performance. Just a statement of fact delivered to the dark air of a chapel at midnight, witnessed by no one who would ever speak of it again. Then his hand found hers. She hadn't expected that, the deliberateness of it, the way his fingers closed around hers with a steadiness that had nothing of tenderness in it and yet was not unkind. He slid the ring onto her finger, gold and heavier than she'd anticipated. Cold from being held in his breast pocket all evening, cold from the chapel air, cold in the way of something real and permanent and irreversible. She knew before his men did. That was the thing Christian couldn't quite account for. He had associates who had worked beside him for a decade, men who had learned to read a room, to track his moods the way sailors tracked weather, because the cost of misreading him was high. And still, on a Tuesday morning in the third week of their arrangement, it was Cecilia who said quietly from across the breakfast table, "Whatever they told you on that call, it isn't the whole truth," before he had said a single word about the call at all. He had looked at her for a long moment. She was facing slightly left of him, her hands wrapped around her mug, expression unhurried. "What makes you say that?" he said. "Not a question. A test. You came in breathing differently." She said it simply, without drama. "You breathe through your nose when you're processing something routine. When something is wrong, actually wrong, you breathe through your mouth. Slower. Like you're buying time." The call had been about a shipment discrepancy that turned out, by afternoon, to be a deliberate misdirection by a man Christian had trusted for 6 years. Cecilia had known something was fractured before Christian had finished his coffee. He didn't tell her she was right, but he stopped leaving the room to take calls when she was present. It became a quiet, unspoken arrangement. She never asked to be involved. She simply existed in the same space and occasionally said things, offhand, careful, precise, that had the texture of information he hadn't known he needed. She told him once that the man he'd had over for dinner had a habit of pausing too long before using someone's name, which meant he'd had to remind himself of it, which meant he was less familiar with Christian's world than he was presenting himself to be. Christian had run a check by morning. She had been right about that too. He began to understand what Elias had meant. Not that Cecilia needed protecting from the world, but that the world needed protecting from the fact that she could read it more clearly than anyone in it, and no one had ever thought to tell her that was a power rather than a consolation. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that understanding, but he stopped looking at her the way a man looks at a debt. He started looking at her the way a man looks at something he has badly and inexcusably underestimated. They arrived unannounced, which told Cecilia everything she needed to know about how the visit would go. Her Aunt Margot had a particular walk, heels that struck marble like a declaration, and her Uncle Petre never entered a room quietly when he could enter it loudly. She heard them in the foyer before Dora had finished opening the door. They settled in the sitting room and dispensed with the pretense of concern in under 4 minutes. Cecilia counted. Margot asked twice if she was eating enough, the kind of question designed to sound caring while reminding the recipient of their fragility. And then Petre set a document on the table beside Cecilia's knee with the deliberate placement of a man who had rehearsed the gesture. "It's straightforward," he said. "A transfer of estate management. Given your situation, it makes sense for the family to oversee Elias's assets until you're more settled." "My situation," Cecilia repeated. "You know what he means, darling." Margot's voice had the particular softness of a woman who had spent years disguising condescension as concern. "You can't manage finances you can't see. No one would expect you to." Cecilia said nothing. She had learned, very young, that silence unnerved people who were used to being accommodated. She let it sit. What she had not expected was the change in air pressure, the almost atmospheric shift that preceded Christian entering a room when he was displeased. She felt it before she heard him. Then his footsteps, unhurried, crossing the threshold. "I don't believe we scheduled this," he said. The temperature in the room dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Petre began an explanation. Christian let him finish the way a man lets a clock run down, patiently, with complete indifference to its noise. Then he picked up the document from beside Cecilia's knee, and without reading it, without looking at it, held it out toward Petre between 2 fingers as though returning something mildly unpleasant. "My wife's estate is managed by my lawyers," he said. "If your family requires anything further, you'll submit the request in writing and wait." Pause exquisitely timed. "You're good at waiting. You've been doing it since Elias was alive." Margot did not finish her tea. They were gone in 6 minutes. Cecilia sat very still after the door closed. Then, quietly, she said, "You didn't have to do that." Christian was already walking away. "I know," he said. He took her on a Sunday, which surprised her. Christian did not observe Sundays. He observed schedules, obligations, outcomes, but not the particular quiet of a Sunday afternoon, which until now had moved through the house like something he had no use for. The garden was at the back of the property, enclosed by a stone wall that Cecilia had not yet mapped. She counted steps automatically as they walked. 17 from the terrace door, a slight drop in the ground at 22 that Christian steadied her through without comment, his hand at her elbow brief and matter-of-fact. She noted that too, the way he was learning how to help her without making it a thing. He stopped them at what she guessed was the center of it. She could smell roses, old ones, the kind with a heaviness to their scent, and beneath that, cut grass and warm stone. The sun was on her face at a low angle. Late afternoon. She turned toward it instinctively. "What does it look like?" she said. Not quite a question. A pause. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. "The sky is doing something complicated," he said finally. His voice had lost its boardroom precision. Something in it slightly unguarded, the way voices went when people forgot to perform. Orange at the bottom, the kind of orange that's almost embarrassing, like it's trying too hard. Another pause. Then it goes up through pink. Not soft pink, something more aggressive than that. And then this particular shade of dark red that I don't have a better word for than the color of something that cost more than it should have. Cecilia smiled before she meant to. That's a terrible description, she said. I know. He didn't sound bothered by it. The clouds are going purple at the edges. The kind of purple that looks like a bruise, but in a way that isn't ugly. He stopped, started again. I don't do this. Describe sunsets? Talk without a reason. She turned her face toward him then. Not quite at him, slightly past. The way she always did. Her eyes finding a point just beyond his shoulder. But close enough. Near enough that he would have to decide what to do with the proximity. You had a reason, she said quietly. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet. He said nothing, but he didn't move away. And they stayed there until the sun finished whatever complicated thing it was doing and the garden went cool and dark around them. She heard the window before anyone else did. Not breaking, it hadn't broken yet, but straining. A barely there pressure against the latch of the east corridor window, the kind of sound a house makes when something outside it is testing its edges. Cecilia had been in the library when it happened, 3 rooms away, and she had gone still the way she always went still when a sound didn't belong. Head slightly tilted, the rest of her body quieted to nothing so that her hearing could do its work without interference. The gala had filled the ground floor with the low roar of 50 conversations and a string quartet working through something Cecilia didn't recognize. Christian was somewhere below. She could have found him by sound alone. She knew his footfall now, the particular weight and rhythm of it, and his men were distributed across the property in the configuration they always used for events. She knew that too. She had listened to the briefing through the study door 3 days prior and said nothing about it. The window sound came again. Then a footstep that was not a guest's footstep. Too careful, too deliberate, carrying the specific quality of someone trying to make no sound at all, which paradoxically made them louder to her than the 50 people downstairs who weren't trying. She moved without turning on a light. 14 steps to the library door. Left into the corridor, hand brushing the wall. She found the house phone by the console table at the corridor's end and picked it up and dialed the extension. Christian's head of security had made her memorize her first week in the house, in a tone that suggested he thought it was a formality. When he answered, she spoke quietly and without preamble. There is someone in the east corridor on the 2nd floor. He's been still for the last 40 seconds, which means he has a sight line he's waiting on. The window he came through is 4 rooms from the top of the main staircase. A pause. Christian uses the main staircase. Silence on the line. Then, how do you? Please hurry, she said, and set the phone down. She counted the seconds from behind the library door, her back against the wall, her breathing steady. 31 seconds later, she heard shouting, brief, controlled, resolved. Then Christian's footsteps on the stairs, faster than usual, moving toward her. He opened the library door and stood in the frame and said nothing for a moment. I'm fine, she said before he could ask. Are you? He exhaled, mouth not nose. She noticed. No, he said, and she understood he didn't mean physically. She found out the way she found out most things, by listening to something that was not meant for her. The next day it was not deliberate. She had come downstairs for water at 2 in the morning and Christian's study door was open by an inch, which was enough. His voice and another man's, low and clipped, the kind of conversation that had no patience for full sentences. She had stopped in the corridor the way she always stopped when a sound carried weight. The original contract was always on you, the other man said. Elias stepped in front of it. That's not something you ordered. I know what it is, Christian said. Then you know the girl has been living inside your guilt for 6 months. That's not the same as living inside your protection. A long silence. Then the door clicked shut and Cecilia stood alone in the dark corridor with a glass of water she no longer wanted. She went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and did what she always did when something needed understanding. She went very still and let it settle. The night of the accident. Elias, who had been Christian's shadow for 7 years, who had placed himself between his boss and every consequence the job produced. The car that had found them on a road that only 3 people had known they would be on that night. The bullet that had not been random, that had been directed, that had been meant for a man who was currently asleep 2 corridors away while she sat here rebuilding everything she thought she understood. Elias had not simply died in Christian's service. He had died in Christian's place. And Christian, who kept promises because he never lost, who had married her in a midnight chapel with a gold ring and 2 words and the careful weight of a man honoring a debt, had built this entire arrangement on the foundation of that fact. She was not just the sister of a dead man. She was the sister of the man who had taken his bullet. She was the living, breathing shape of everything Christian could not undo. She pressed her fingers against the ring on her hand. It was warm now. It had been cold the night he'd put it on her. Cold from his breast pocket. Cold from the chapel air. It had taken weeks to carry her own temperature. She wondered if that meant something or if she was simply a woman who had learned to find meaning in the only thing she could feel. In the morning, she said nothing. She made coffee the way she always made it. 3 steps left of the sink, second shelf, and when Christian came in and sat down and breathed through his nose in the slow, unremarkable way that meant the morning was routine, she understood that he did not know she knew. She decided to let him keep that for now. Not out of forgiveness. Out of the terrible, inconvenient realization that knowing the truth had not made her feel less. It had made her feel more. And she did not yet know what to do with that. Margot had called it a reconciliation lunch. Private, she'd said. Just family. She had used the word family 4 times in the message, which Dora had read aloud to Cecilia with the careful neutrality of a woman who had opinions she had not been asked for. Cecilia had gone anyway, not because she trusted her aunt, because she was tired of being the thing in Christian's house that needed protecting, and because some part of her still believed that the people who were supposed to love you deserved one final chance to prove they meant it. They didn't. The restaurant was real. The first 20 minutes were real, stiff conversation, Margot's performance of warmth, Petre's performance of remorse. Then a man she didn't recognize sat down uninvited on her left, and another closed off the exit behind her. And Margot's voice dropped to something quiet and businesslike and entirely unrecognizable. Elias's estate, her aunt said, is worth more than your loyalty to a man who bought you like a debt settlement. All you have to do is sign. Cecilia understood then, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent years learning to read what people didn't say, exactly what had happened. Margot and Petre had gone looking for leverage after Christian humiliated them in the sitting room, and they had found the Renko family, who had been circling Elias's hidden assets for 2 years and needed only one thing to access them. Cecilia's signature on a transfer of estate. A blind, isolated woman with no legal representation present and 2 men blocking the exits was, in their calculation, a manageable problem. They had miscalculated. She counted everything on the way out. Steps, turns, the texture of the floor changing from tile to concrete. A vehicle. 31 minutes of driving. A space that smelled of cold metal and standing water, basement or close to it. They locked a door between her and the world and left her with a document she could not see and a pen pressed into her hand and the specific silence of people who believed that without her sight she was already halfway to helpless. She set the pen down on the floor. Then she sat with her back against the far wall and she waited, because Christian would come, and when he came he would need her to be exactly where she was and not somewhere complicated. What she did not know, could not have known, was what it cost him to get there. Later she would learn that the Renko family had moved on 3 of his operations simultaneously, using the same window they'd used to take her. A deliberate double play, designed to leave him choosing between his empire and a blind girl in a basement. That his men had been divided, his assets frozen, his name dragged into a federal inquiry that would take 18 months to dissolve. That every bridge he burned that afternoon to clear a path to her was a bridge he had spent a decade building. That he had made the calculation in under a minute and had not looked back. She only knew the moment the door came open. His footsteps crossing the room, faster than she had ever heard them, stripped of their usual deliberate weight. His hands finding her in the dark with a certainty that meant he had not slowed at the threshold, had not needed to, had known exactly where she would be. "I have you," he said. The words barely held their shape. She pressed her hands to his face the way she mapped everything she needed to understand. The jaw, the scar, the place where everything he kept controlled had finally, completely come apart. He was breathing through his mouth, ragged and unguarded, and she knew what that meant. She had always known what that meant. "They wanted me to sign the estate over," she said. "Margot handed me to them for a percentage." She felt the tension move through him like a current. "I didn't sign." "I know," he said. "You wouldn't. I also know about the night of the accident," she continued. "About the bullet. About all of it." A pause. "I've known for weeks." The silence that followed was long and total and had the quality of something that had needed to exist for a long time. "And you stayed," he said finally. Not a question. Something closer to a man encountering a fact he has no framework for. "You burned down half your empire today to walk through that door," she said quietly. "So did you." His forehead came down to hers. Outside, the cost of the afternoon was still being counted. Territory, money, 20 years of carefully constructed consequence. All of it settling into ash. He found, in a basement that smelled of cold metal, that he could not make himself care about any of it. She was the only person alive who knew him, all of him, and had chosen to stay anyway. In his world, that was rarer than power, rarer than loyalty, rarer than anything he had ever known how to hold on to. He intended to learn. Thank you for listening. Please remember to click the subscribe button, like and share so I can keep bringing you amazing stories like Cecilia's. Goodbye.